It was late November of 1973 in western Michigan. The kind of cold that settles early and stays through the night. The Harris family farmhouse sat nearly a mile off the county road, surrounded by harvested cornfields and bordered by a thin line of trees that marked the edge of their property. There were no close neighbors, no street lights, and no regular nighttime traffic. After dark, the area became a stretch of uninterrupted black sky and open land. Robert Harris had worked the property for over a decade. He knew the sounds of that land the way some men know the creaks of their own home. He knew when wind moved through dry stalks. He knew when deer crossed the field. He knew the distant hum of a crop duster and the sharp, mechanical chop of a helicopter flying too low. On the night of November 18th, there were no unusual reports, no storms, no scheduled aircraft activity, no power fluctuations. The family had gone to bed just after 11. His wife, Carol, had turned off the television, checked the doors, and set the small kitchen clock before heading upstairs. Their two children, Emily and Daniel, had already fallen asleep. At approximately 1:37 a.m., Robert woke up. He would later insist it was not a noise that woke him. It was light. At first, he assumed a vehicle had turned into their long gravel drive. That happened occasionally when someone took the wrong road. But as he opened his eyes, he noticed something strange about the glow in the room. It was steady, not sweeping across the walls like headlights would, not shifting or bouncing the way moving beams would normally behave. The light was simply present. A pale white glow pressed through the edges of the curtains and rested along the ceiling above the bed. It did not flicker. It did not flash. It held. Beside him, Carol stirred. She noticed the light almost immediately. Neither of them spoke at first. They both watched the ceiling in silence, trying to rationalize what they were seeing. Robert swung his legs off the bed and crossed the room carefully. As he approached the window, the glow intensified slightly, though it did not brighten the entire yard. It seemed focused, contained. When he pulled the curtain aside just a few inches, he did not see headlights. He did not see a vehicle in the drive. What he saw instead was a black mass suspended beyond the tree line. For a moment, his mind refused to process it. The shape was darker than the sky behind it, absorbing what little moonlight there was. It did not resemble an airplane. It did not resemble a helicopter. There were no wings, no visible propellers, no blinking red navigation lights. Beneath the dark body of the object were several steady lights, arranged in a loose, triangular formation. They cast a controlled glow downward into the field. But there was no sound, no rotor wash, no vibration, no movement in the trees below it. The object was hovering at a height Robert would later estimate at roughly 60 to 80 feet above the ground. It was not large like a commercial jet, but it was far too large to be mistaken for a drone or hobby aircraft. especially in 1973. Carol joined him at the window. She saw it immediately. The silence between them confirmed what neither wanted to say aloud. This was not something familiar. Within minutes, their daughter Emily woke up, complaining that her room felt bright. Daniel followed shortly after. The family gathered in the front room, standing shoulder to shoulder in the darkness, watching the object hover beyond the barn. Robert briefly considered stepping outside, but something about the stillness of the air made him hesitate. It wasn't fear in the conventional sense. It was caution. The kind of instinct that tells you the environment has changed in a way you don't understand. Then the object moved. Not quickly, not dramatically. It shifted laterally, gliding sideways with a smoothness that felt mechanical yet effortless. There was no acceleration, no banking motion. It simply repositioned itself as though correcting its alignment. The lights beneath it brightened slightly as it drifted toward the barn. Inside the farmhouse, the air felt heavier. Carol would later describe a pressure in her ears, similar to the sensation of descending rapidly in an airplane. Emily began to cry quietly, unable to explain why she felt so uneasy. Daniel stood still, staring through the glass as if trying to force the shape into something recognizable. Robert kept waiting for sound, for some sign that gravity or air resistance applied to this thing. But the night remained silent. The object hovered directly above the barn now, its underside lights illuminating the roof in steady white. No heat distortion, no movement in the trees, no mechanical rhythm, just presence. And the family, watching from inside their home, understood they were witnessing something that did not behave like any aircraft they had ever known. If you're drawn to slow-burn investigative accounts like this, documented encounters told carefully and without exaggeration, consider subscribing. This channel focuses on reported cases examined in detail, without theatrics. Now, back to the Harris family. The object remained above the barn longer than any of them expected. What unsettled Robert most was not simply the presence of the craft, but the way the environment seemed to react, or rather, fail to react to it. A structure that size, hovering that low, should have displaced air. It should have produced some measurable disturbance. Yet the trees at the edge of the field stood completely still. The loose sheet of tin on the side of the barn, which normally rattled even in light wind, did not move. The lights beneath the craft were steady and controlled, illuminating the barn roof and the ground behind it with unnatural clarity. There was no visible beam cutting through the darkness, no spotlight effect that swept across the land. The glow seemed contained, almost disciplined, as if it were meant only to reveal what was directly below it, and nothing more. Carol whispered that perhaps it was military. The early 70s were full of rumors about experimental aircraft, secret testing programs, and technology the public never saw. But even the most advanced machines produced sound. Even helicopters attempting stealth operations carried a low mechanical rhythm that could be felt through the chest before it was heard by the ears. This carried nothing. Inside the farmhouse, subtle changes began to register. The small electric clock in the kitchen, visible from the hallway, had stopped ticking. Robert noticed it when he glanced away from the window. The second hand had frozen between numbers. The house lights were still on. The refrigerator continued humming. Yet the clock was motionless. Moments later, the television in the living room emitted a short burst of static before the screen went black. There was no spark, no pop, no smell of burning wire. It simply shut off. Emily pressed her palms against her ears and said they felt full, as if pressure were building inside her head. Daniel swallowed repeatedly and complained of a dull ache behind his eyes. The sensation was not sharp or stabbing. It was compressive, steady, and difficult to describe. Robert stepped toward the back door, not with the intention of going outside, but to gain a clearer view of the field from a different angle. As he approached the door, the object shifted again. The movement was subtle, but unmistakable. It repositioned itself slightly closer to the farmhouse. Not directly above the roof, not descending aggressively, but closer than before. The adjustment was smooth and measured, as though the craft were correcting its placement with precision. Carol asked quietly if they should call someone. Robert considered it, but the phone hung on the kitchen wall, and the idea of turning away from the window felt wrong. He could not explain the feeling. It was not panic. It was awareness. A sense that whatever hovered above their property was aware of them as well. For nearly 8 minutes, the object remained suspended in that position. The lights beneath it dimmed and brightened subtly, never flashing, never blinking. Its body appeared matte in the faint glow, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. There were no visible seams, no rivets, no exhaust trails. It was simply a dark shape holding its place in the air. Then, without warning, the craft began to rise. The ascent was vertical and steady. There was no banking motion, no tilt forward as an airplane would require. It lifted straight upward, as though the concept of gravity applied differently to it. The lights remained visible until the object cleared the tree line, and even then, there was no accompanying sound. Within seconds, it blended into the night sky above. The field returned to shadow. The barn roof faded back into darkness. The air inside the farmhouse seemed to release whatever tension it had been holding. The dog emerged cautiously from beneath the kitchen table. A moment later, the kitchen clock resumed ticking. Robert stood in the doorway long after the object had disappeared. He listened for distant aircraft noise, for any sign that something conventional had been in the area. There was nothing, only the wind returning to the trees, as though the night had briefly paused, and then continued. The Harris family did not return to bed. For several minutes after the object disappeared, they remained standing near the window, expecting something else to follow. A second pass, a return, a sound delayed by distance. But the sky remained empty. The field beyond the barn settled back into its ordinary darkness, indistinguishable from any other November night. Robert eventually stepped outside. The cold air struck him immediately, sharp and grounding. The porch boards creaked beneath his weight as they always had. The ordinary sounds of rural Michigan began filtering back in. Distant wind moving across harvested rows, the faint rustle of tree branches along the property line. Nothing about the environment suggested that something extraordinary had hovered there only moments earlier. He walked several steps into the yard and looked upward, searching for navigation lights or the distant blink of an aircraft repositioning itself farther away. The sky offered nothing. No red strobes, no fading hum, no retreating silhouette, just stars. He circled toward the side of the house, listening carefully. Carol remained in the doorway, unwilling to step fully into the yard. The children watched from behind her, silent now, subdued in a way that felt older than their years. Robert approached the barn cautiously, scanning the ground as he moved. If something mechanical had hovered that low, there should have been evidence. Displaced soil, broken branches, residual heat. But as he drew closer, the land appeared largely undisturbed. It was not until morning light that he noticed the only irregularity. Behind the barn, in the field that had been illuminated by the craft's underside lights, there was an oval-shaped patch of grass pressed in a uniform direction. Not scorched, not burned, simply laid down, as if something heavy had hovered just above it. The soil beneath remained intact. There were no tire tracks leading in or out, no footprints other than his own. The truck, which had functioned normally the previous evening, would not start that morning. The battery was fully drained. Robert had to jump it later that afternoon using a neighbor's equipment. He could not determine whether that failure was connected or a coincidence. The kitchen clock functioned normally again. The television powered back on without issue. Nothing inside the home appeared permanently damaged. Later that day, after discussion with Carol, Robert contacted the local sheriff's office. The conversation was brief. He described a silent aircraft hovering low over his property, accompanied by unusual electrical interference. The deputy on the line asked whether there had been lights, whether there was sound, whether anyone else in the area had called. No formal report was filed. There were no follow-up visits. No investigators arrived to inspect the field. The Harris property returned to routine within days. Yet the family did not return to normal as easily. In the weeks that followed, both children reported difficulty sleeping. Emily complained occasionally of headaches that her pediatrician attributed to stress. Daniel avoided looking out the windows at night. Carol admitted privately that she had begun listening more carefully to the silence outside the house, as if expecting it to change again without warning. Robert said very little. He continued working the land, continued maintaining the barn, continued rising before dawn. But he admitted years later that he never again stepped into the yard at night without first scanning the sky. There were no missing time episodes, no figures observed in the field, no additional sightings in the months that followed. The encounter remained contained to that single night. In the decades since, Michigan has recorded numerous UFO reports, many rural, many described as silent. Some include multiple witnesses. Others describe electrical interference or brief physiological sensations similar to those the Harris children reported. The Harris encounter never entered official databases. It remained what many rural reports remain: observed, remembered, undocumented. 4 witnesses standing at a farmhouse window in 1973 described a black craft hovering low over their land, silent and controlled, moving with intention but without aggression. It did not pursue. It did not land. It did not communicate. It simply watched. And then it left. If what they described was experimental military technology, it was years ahead of what was publicly acknowledged. If it was something else, it behaved in a way that suggested awareness rather than accident. The most consistent detail across every retelling was not the lights or the movement or even the electrical interference. It was the silence. A silence so complete that it felt manufactured. A silence that made the ordinary night sounds feel absent rather than distant. And for the Harris family, that silence never felt entirely natural again. They did not claim abduction. They did not claim contact. They did not build mythology around what they saw. They described a craft that behaved with control, moved without sound, and hovered over their land as though observation was its only purpose. Then it left. In 1973, rural Michigan was not a place where extraordinary claims spread quickly. Stories like this stayed inside kitchens and at family tables. They were told carefully, sometimes only once. Whether the Harris family witnessed experimental technology, a misidentified aircraft, or something that does not fit comfortably into either category, remains unresolved. What remains consistent is the detail they never disagreed on: the silence. If you're drawn to documented encounters told carefully, without exaggeration or theatrics, consider subscribing. We release new investigations every week, exploring reported cases that sit in the space between explanation and uncertainty. Until next time, stay aware and stay safe.